All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today. My name is Phoebe Schumacher, and I'm a senior consultant at Cred Consulting. We're really excited to have you here this afternoon. And today's webinar is part of Cred Consulting's series of free Creducation webinars. And this is where we join our colleagues and friends to share knowledge and ideas. So today we'll be talking all about social assets, their role in disaster resilience, and some case studies of really successful community buildings as well, which we're excited to get stuck into. But before we begin, I would like to take a minute to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander participants dialing into today's webinar. And I'm joining from Gadigal land today in Sydney's Surrey Hills. So who are we? And I think a lot of you probably have come to our previous Creducation webinars or are friends and project partners or clients of ours, which is really exciting. So we're very happy to have you here today. But for anyone who is new to this series or doesn't know much about us, thought I'd provide a little overview. So Cred Consulting is a national multidisciplinary team of people first, social planning, research and engagement consultants. And our real purpose here at Cred is really creating resilient, equitable, and beautiful communities, places, and cities. And we have a range of services that we deliver, and that includes social research, engagement, strategy, communications, and social value. And we've been delivering our Creducation webinar series for a couple of years now, which is really exciting. And it's allowed us to really delve into some fantastic topics with many of our colleagues and friends. Things we've touched on include, understanding social infrastructure needs and how to fund them, how to work alongside First Nations communities as expert partners, and even our very own 6 C's of engagement framework. So if you're interested in checking out any of our previous webinars, I really encourage you to take a look. All the recordings are up on our website at credconsulting.com.au/creducation. So today we're really happy to be here with Dunhillam Architecture and Urban Design, and we're delivering our webinar in collaboration with them today. So Dunhillam are a really fantastic collaborative team who work all over Australia, and they deliver some amazing work. So we're excited to be really leveraging our combined expertise and bringing it to today's conversation. So we know that, I guess, and as you all know, we'll be talking about social assets, and I'm sure you've seen a little bit of info about sort of the topics that we'll be covering today. But what we know is that social assets are really essential community facilities, services, and groups. They connect us, they create trusted networks, and they really form the building blocks of community and disaster resilience. And, the place-based and nuanced planning for social assets really does matter. And it starts with, understanding needs, adaptable design, and really ongoing funding and management. So we're lucky to have a really wonderful panel with us today, and they'll be taking us through all things social assets. So I'm excited to be joined by our Managing Director, Sarah Riley, and our Director, Jen Geist today. So Sarah is the founder and CEO of Cred Consulting. I'm sure many of you know Sarah, and she's one of Australia's leading thinkers. She really champions the design of equitable and beautiful places and services and with the people that they're for. Sarah is also this year's recipient of the PR New South Wales Outstanding Woman in Planning Award, which is very well deserved. Jen is also one of our directors at Cred. So Jen is a real leader in the industry in designing and delivering really fantastic research and engagement projects that really build that community resilience and social cohesion. And Jen will be talking a little bit more about that today as well. And then we're thrilled to be joined by 2 of our wonderful friends. So we've got Ashley Dunn and Lee Hillam here, who are both founding principals of Dunhillam Architecture and Urban Design, and they're experts in all areas of architecture and urban design. So we'll be hearing from them today on some really exciting projects that they've been working on and the social assets and kind of the value they've been adding in that space. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So in the first part of today's webinar, we'll be hearing directly from our panel, and then we will jump into Q&A at the end. So we'll have lots of time for questions, and we really love to hear all of your questions. So I really encourage you to submit them throughout the webinar. You can use the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar anytime throughout the session, and we'll come to your questions at the end. And so please, take the opportunity to submit any burning questions for our panel. And today's session is also being recorded, so we'll send you the recording afterward. All right, so That was a lot to get through, but I think to kick us off today, we'll throw it over to Sarah, and I'm going to ask Sarah to start us off by really talking about what a social asset actually is, because that might be news to some of our attendees today, what its value is, and what some of the key challenges and opportunities are in that space. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Phoebe. Yeah, thanks for joining everyone on a topic that many of you know is a real passion of mine and of Cred's. From our work with communities, social and health services, social infrastructure funders, designers, and deliverers, we know that social assets have always been essential. But as we're facing more ongoing shocks and cumulative stresses, they're going to become even more so. But as someone who's been working in this field for a really long time, more than 20 years, we all know their value. We hear people talk about their value all the time, but it's not always understood by decision makers. And what creates some practical challenges to their sustainability or collective resilience, I'd like to talk about today as well. So while we know how important they are, it's not always that easy to get people who fund them or deliver them to understand that value. And we've seen lots of changes over time, particularly around how we fund things. So what are social assets? Social assets are not just buildings. When we talk about assets, sometimes we can get caught up on buildings. Social assets are people and groups. So those community members and those leaders in community who really connect people up. It's around the information and engagement, institutions and agencies. Institutions are things like local government or state government. Community facilities and public spaces, those really important buildings that house all the services and house all the information or provide the places for programs to be delivered. And also those community services and associations. There are so many things that come together, and they start from the individual in a community and go all the way up to our big institutions at the top of government. And we have to see them working in a network and make sure that all of those groups are connecting with each other, and from the individual all the way up. So they do connect us to each other, to programs and services, to information, and to opportunities. And I think that's a really important aspect of social assets. They support our health and well-being, and we've seen increasing costs to our governments at all levels, declining health, social isolation, obesity, all sorts of things, because there has been a decline in how we're investing in social assets over time. By investing in social assets, though, we can reduce government costs, we can make people happier and more connected. They can really be considered as a small seeding investment for a really long-term economic, social, and cultural benefits. Thanks, Phoebes. Another term you've probably been hearing a lot about lately, which is not a new term, it's been around for eons, is the term social capital. And social capital is about how we bond with each other, how we bridge opportunities out of the situations we're in, and how we link to the services and institutions that we need to make changes in our lives or to have better lives. And social assets really are the foundations. And Dunhill and I'm going to talk about the community buildings as building blocks, but they really are what the building blocks for the how we create social capital. From the places that we bond with each other about things that are similar between us, or things that we can get together about, like comfortable places to sit, community groups, cafes and clubs, little community sheds and communal spaces, to the places that build or bridge relationships between different groups. And that might be at school or at childcare, or it might be at community centres, or ever more importantly, those community events and celebrations that we're seeing, particularly local government, taking much more interest in delivering much more. Communities really want those places that they can connect and gather with different groups in their communities. And then those social assets that link us to the services and opportunities that we need. That's basically what social assets can do. They build social capital, and social capital is absolutely an essential type of capital. All we hear about really is economic capital, but social capital is something that we really need to start building and investing in. Thanks, Phoebes. But we know that access to those social assets, those places and spaces, those services and groups really depends on who you are. A while back, we did a really interesting heat mapping exercise where we mapped all the places or spaces or groups and services that you could connect socially across what used to be the 3 cities in Sydney. And what was really clear was that those older, more established cities that had lots of buildings and spaces and groups and services had way more social assets for people to build social capital. But in our bigger growing cities, like our Western Parkland city, which is out in Western Sydney, there there was a way less. And that area where you can kind of see on the left where there's all the white, there is so much population growth going on there now, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people from culturally diverse backgrounds, and some with, you know, some other socio-economic challenges. That's where we need to see that investment in social assets happening as well. Access to social assets also depends on where you live. And Phoebe, if you go to the next slide. When we worked in the Snowy Valleys, we actually mapped again the social connectors in each of the villages across the whole of the Snowy Valleys post bushfire. And what was really clear was, you know, if you lived in the main villages, the main towns, there were lots of different places and spaces and groups and services where you could connect with each other. But once you got out into some of the smaller villages, there weren't as many places and spaces, and people did feel particularly disconnected to the institutions and those big services and agencies that provide those services for them. But they did have very strong bonding capital and places that they could bond with each other, like little parks or a local cafe. So they had strong bonding capital, but less so access to that bridging and those linking places that bridge and link them together. Thanks, Phoebes. I think another really important part about social assets is that sometimes it gets really there's I think a lot of focus on local government in particular to be delivering social assets or to be working around social assets. But funding, delivery, and management of social assets is really the responsibility of many groups, from the federal government, who's responsible for lots of funding and grants, from the state government, who's responsible for lots of service delivery, funding, and grants. And also infrastructure delivery, to local government, who, you know, really takes care of their local communities, delivers that local infrastructure, plans for those local social assets, and works so closely with its community. To the private sector, who deliver lots of our parks and our community spaces and all those sorts of things, and also, you know, run local businesses as well, who are really big social connectors and social assets. To our communities, who in many, many ways are involved in every single aspect of social assets design and delivery. Thanks, Phoebes. But just wanted to end on some challenges and opportunities that are becoming really apparent, have been apparent over the years, and also through all the services groups that we've spoken to over time. Some of the challenges that we're facing around social assets, things like that lots of communities or councils aren't ready with their need studies or plans in place, so that when those grants come across their tables, they're not ready to go and apply for those grants. We hear that a lot, particularly from community groups or from councils, that a grant comes along, you've got 4 weeks to apply, but they're not ready with those projects. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that later. That there's no legislative requirement for any social infrastructure. Social assets don't seem to be valued in the same way that other sorts of assets are, like roads, for example. There's been a consistent decline in funding to our not-for-profit organisations and an increasingly privatised social health and services environment. For example, 10 years ago, our childcare, our aged care, and our disability care wasn't privatised, but now it's pretty much delivered through the private sector. And so that means that there's a decline in funding in some ways, and a for-profit approach for a lot of those services now. There's also a really competitive funding environment rather than collective action approach. So a lot of our services working in our communities and with our community groups and providing those services up to government are competing for the same pool of funding, which means that collective action is more difficult to achieve. Implementability is a bit of a challenge, with multiple agencies responsible from local to regional outcomes across our communities, particularly in growth areas. And there's a lot of fatigue in our volunteer and services, particularly in places that are experiencing ongoing and cumulative shocks and stresses, a lack of business continuity as well. Those people who are delivering those services and running those businesses are also the same people who are being impacted by these disasters. So there's some of the challenges that we're facing. But it's not all bad news. There's lots of opportunities we can think about. We can change the way we're managing things. We can fund our local government agencies to do LGA-wide social assets need studies. And we can also fund community-led, place-based community resilience plans, because we know that every community is different, as I showed you earlier. Every place is different, every community is different. So community-led, place-based plans can really help for that social asset planning and resilience. We can make sure that our place-based services really get funded well and are really looked after, and they are involved in all those emergency services committees as well, not just the big NGOs, those ones that are trusted. Representation is really, really important to communities. We can start to recognise in legislation the high value of our social assets. We can give communities more permission. I don't know about you, but I feel like permission to do anything has been taken away from me in the last 10 years. There are so many controls, but communities can take action and communities can do amazing things. So how do we enable that? And we can allow access to flexible and upfront funding during emergencies for our local services, and really try to work toward an environment of collaboration and not just competition for our local services. It's a big shift. It's something that is a big challenge for all of us, but I think as an industry, we can start to work together to make those changes. Thanks, Phoebes.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. And at CRED, we're really lucky to be able to talk to thousands of community members every year about, their lived experience and really what some of these challenges are as well. So I'm going to hand over to Jen now to talk about some of the really key insights that have been coming out from, our consultation over the years. So over to you, Jen.
Thanks, Phoebes. Yeah, we're really blessed actually to talk to thousands of community members right across the country every year. So the insights that we gather, we don't even realize this half the time until we get into conversations with people, that we really have our finger on the pulse of what people are experiencing, what's different across communities, but also what is similar in terms of policy making. The work we do with communities time and again proves the theory about social capital, that social assets are essential community facilities, services, and groups that connect us, create the trusted networks that we need to form the building blocks of community resilience. What we hear that community need to be more resilient, particularly regarding social assets, is trusted information from trusted sources. So this might mean local leaders or locally embedded government staff. The real focus there is locally embedded, popping up at the local stock and feed store. That's something that regional and rural farmers explain to us, that they really would pass somebody by if they weren't a locally embedded government employee. And they like to see them at the places that they go, like the stock and feed store. It might mean the local chemist in a regional community. That was really important in Tumbarumba, for example, pre and post fires in that community. The chemist was seen as the really trusted place to go for information. The local service station sounds a bit bizarre, but in emerging communities in Western Sydney, where the local service station acts as multiple ways for people to connect, not just filling up their vehicles, which they need through lack of transport in the areas, but also sometimes as the closest store to buy food. It could be place-based services that know their community and the individuals in that community and what their needs are during a disaster, which came out from research that we did in Fairfield post-COVID about the important role that the place-based services played in that community to really understand the nuanced needs of that particular highly multicultural community. Or it could be the traditional custodians of country, which really was expressed clearly to us from the Wadi Wadi traditional owners in the Wollongong area when we did some work in that part of the world around future land use planning. So time and again, we hear that people trust people they know. It's really crucial to have local voices delivering information, but also in ways that the community are already used to receiving that information. And that could include digital and analog methods, and it might need to include in community language where appropriate. Some examples that we hear time again that people trust are local Facebook groups, neighbours, particularly in rural and regional areas. Local radio is really important, particularly regionally. And as I've said, from people who live and work in the community, so there's an understanding of the experiences. So what do people want? They want places and spaces to build community connections and support each other. They're particularly concerned about the most vulnerable in their community and making sure that the most vulnerable have access to those places and spaces as well, that they feel welcome in key places and spaces in their communities, so that they can also form bonds and connections and be safe during disasters. We know that many community members, particularly in rural and regional areas, but also in right across Greater Sydney, already access key community assets. But what they want to see, like places like libraries, community centres, halls, that sort of thing, but what they really want to see is that they become more accessible to everybody. So whether that's disability accessibility, but also a welcoming for everybody, and also to be disaster ready. So things like including kitchens, showers, generators, telecommunications, including the small stuff like providing phone chargers. Across the board, whether it's in the city or in regional or rural areas, people want to participate in the decisions being made that will impact their ability to be resilient to disasters. We're really lucky to be able to participate or to develop and deliver participatory research with community, to collaborate and co-design social assets and planning to meet the needs of communities. It's absolutely crucial to get it right for the end users. And not just some of the end users. It's really important to talk to people in communities to understand the nuance of each community's needs in terms of their social assets, in terms of the groups that already exist, and the important leaders, identifying the important leaders in those groups. So local community resilience planning, which we've had a really great time doing over the last few years with disaster affected communities in the Central Coast, for example, in the Snowy Valleys, in the Hawkesbury region, and also in the Illawarra Shoalhaven. It can really uncover the strengths and needs of a particular community. It can build trust. It can help to build networks and strengthen networks, and also build momentum for communities to be more resilient into the future. For designers, it can answer really important questions like who really are the trusted leaders in this place? Who is most vulnerable here? Who is connected, and really importantly, who isn't connected? And what social assets are already important for that particular community? How do they use them? And really crucially, what's missing? Thanks, Phoebes.
Thank you, Jen. I'm now going to hand over to Ashley and Lee from Dunhillam to talk about some really fantastic social asset projects they've been working on and the value that they've been adding through design.
Thanks, Phoebe. Hi, everyone. So I'm Lee. This is Ashley. Just to get that straight from the start, or very confusing. And we're Dunhillam. We do work, as Phoebe introduced so well for us, mostly in community and arts and culture buildings, and also a little bit in social housing. And a lot of that work is in the regions. A lot of it is with existing buildings, but not always. And our clients are a range, like across the range of the same, I think, similar clients that CRED work with, really, but it's councils and state government, but also community groups and NGOs who get involved in this kind of space. We've always been interested in doing projects that have a positive social impact. And as part of that, we are also a B Corp, which means that we're an organisation that is a for-profit organisation, but we equally prioritise people and planet in our business operations. And it's a great framework for looking at how you have social impact in your projects, but also in the way that you run your business. If you just go to the next slide. So this is just a little map that we do showing some of the community projects we've done over the last 10 years or so. And you can see it's spread across New South Wales. And today we want to talk to you mostly about projects in Cobar in the far west, and then Cobargo down the south coast, and show you a few projects that just have focus on where we've been able to add value beyond the brief, both at a very zoomed out scale and in some of the detail. Now I'm going to pass over to Ashley.
So I'm going to talk about the project in Cobargo. I'm sure all of you remember the devastating fires of 2019-2020. Cobargo was one of the worst hit communities, where their main street was devastated, as well as many homes in the area. So when we got invited in to work with this community, we were dealing with a traumatized community to start with, but we were also dealing with a community that had existing very strong community networks in place, but were very poor on the community assets and social infrastructure, and especially after the fires. The way that this project was put together was by members of the local cooperative, who formed an organisation called the Cobar Community Development Corporation, which started off as a not-for-profit and is now a registered charity. If we move to the next slide, please. This is the main group with me standing in the middle, and everyone's looking really happy because this is the day that we heard from council that the DA had been approved for the project that they've been working on with us for a number of years. And now what that project is, if we go to the next slide, was developed. We had early engagement with the Cobargo community, and we were able to understand the material assets that they needed to replace, like what buildings, shops, and so on. But importantly, that early engagement that we had community-wide, we could understand where the gaps were in the social infrastructure. And that was about gathering spaces. That was about spaces that were not pay for play, places where people of all ages could gather and be part of the community, and it doesn't cost them any money. There were big issues around allied health services, mental health, also local information, having a bit of a community hub that could act as a way, as both as a disaster resilience centre, but also as a day-to-day community centre in order to pass on knowledge. And importantly, the post office was nominated as one of the most important buildings in the town, connecting them to the outside world. So, and really now post offices are around having things delivered to and being sent from. So most of the shopping in Cobargo outside of food happens through the post office. So a new post office was proposed as part of that. If we move to the next slide. The other community that we've been working with for a number of years is similar name, Cobar, very, very different community. It's a mining community out west. It's about 3 hours out of Dubbo, on your way to Burke. We have had the pleasure of working with this local community now over several years on several projects. And the reason we wanted to talk about these projects specifically was the importance of embedding ourselves within community and getting to understand the nuanced issues that happen within those community networks embedded within a place. And by doing that, we're able to facilitate discussions of tying different projects together and identify where the gaps are from a social asset point of view, and then design into individual and specific projects extra program and additional kind of problem solving that importantly doesn't cost any more money. It's by understanding what those issues are, we're able to design into buildings like the museum, which is what we're looking at here, the mining museum, and childcare projects and sporting facilities and local arts centres. We can design in areas of social infrastructure that are lacking to support the existing community networks. Next slide, please. This is a map of Cobar that it might be a little bit hard to read, but the red projects are the projects that we're have either finished or are currently working on with Cobar. And if we move to the next slide, please. These are identified in this this image here. So we've got a museum, we've got an 85-place childcare centre. One of our favourite projects is a bus stop. We've done an extensive renovation on the local youth centre, which has opened that up to many more different parts of the programme and parts of the community. So not just the youth, but also the other end, looking at age care and place a centre where people can come for all ages. We've got a multi-purpose hall, which is part of a master plan for re-looking at their sports facilities in their oval and their showground. We've got 2 more stages in the museum that we're looking at around a coach house and the development of a train carriage that they have that's part of the Royal Far West. We're looking at a master plan for the local pub on the High Street, which is going to be a community centre and also an arts centre. And that is all through discussion with council and understanding where the grants are available and being able to demonstrate where the gaps are in the social assets in town, and therefore having successful grant applications to get the funds to build the capital infrastructure to support the community networks. Next slide, please. This was the, do you want to talk about this one, Lee, actually?
No,
Or I keep talking about it?
Yeah.
So this, the reason that we put this slide in is to talk about the importance of developing master plans. So when the initial discussions with community happen around where the gaps are and what the issues are, quite often architects are brought in well after the program's been developed. What we try and do is get in early to have those discussions to say, well, you need a childcare centre, you need a multi-purpose hall, the Show Society needs new buildings to keep the local show going. We need to make your local sports facilities both more resilient and more sustainable. And we think, but by placing all of these programs together next to the local primary school, with the master plan linking it into the main town, that we can get all of these things to borrow from each other and share from each other and therefore gain added value. And we refer to this as a holistic density, which is where the sum of the parts is greater, well, the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts. And that comes through being knitted deeply within community and addressing the community needs. Next slide, please. A number of the projects that we've done are now complete. This one has just been completed, which is the childcare centre. Brief examples of things that we try and do with buildings like this. Of course, we meet the needs of the childcare centre, but we also look at the out-of-hours operations so the building can earn its keep by working harder. So this becomes a community centre, an out-of-hours centre for disaster relief if that's required, but also a place where other community organisations can meet when it's not operating as a childcare centre, and also using the building to encapsulate the outdoor play space. So we're not reliant on fencing and pushing people out into the harsh climate, but using the architecture to actually provide that protection, and both physical and environmental. Next slide, please. This one is adjacent to that building, which is a multi-purpose hall, which started off as an extension for the Show Society for a show pavilion, but importantly, we identified with the local government a need for a social place within the community that didn't involve alcohol. So this is importantly is a non-licensed venue, and it is now the only non-licensed venue in Cobar where you can hold community events that don't involve the sale of alcohol. Obviously, there's a lot of issues related with alcohol-induced violence and things in regional and rural areas, and that was one of the things that the community identified that they wanted to address. Next slide, please. It's recently finished. The landscaping hasn't gone in yet. Other things that we've done with this building that didn't cost any more money is that out of hours, we provided lots of undercover shaded space around the building. So the building is basically a series of enormous interlinked verandas, which provide, it turns the building into a grandstand to be able to watch sporting events, but it also provides undercover shade for play space for children, for groups to hang out, with good visual access across the rest of the oval, that can all happen outside of the building being open. There's also a set, the changing rooms that are part of this project are also open at different times of day and night, so they can be accessed by the community as a public facility round the clock. Next slide, please. I am going to hand over to you now.
Okay, so just to finish off, I'm going to show you a couple of tiny, well, not the projects are not tiny, but tiny aspects of those projects that I think demonstrate the way that we try to add value. First one you're looking at here is the disabled access ramp that was required for the Cobar Museum. Whenever we're faced with issues of having to achieve compliance for access for a building, we always look at how we can get the most value out of that. So we've introduced a sort of a sculptural ramp here that actually takes you around a sculpture garden and allows you to see the sculptures from different vantage points. And you can see here the local kids who were willing models for us, enjoying running around that and up onto the veranda, which is the main entry into the museum. Next one. And then second, again, disabled access ramp, and this is on the youth centre that we showed you a picture of earlier. which is linked to the skate park. And so this ramp was designed to acknowledge that it's a part of the skate park, really, this youth centre, and that the kids could use it for their scooters and as a sort of a slalom. So you see we introduce a bit of fun there with something that's necessary for compliance. Next. This is an interior shot of the childcare centre, and again, it's not finished, but where you've got issues of you've got to create enclosure, you've got to create shade, and in a traditional way that would mean a fence and a shade cloth on a pole, on a series of poles, whereas we use the eaves of the verandas and of the building itself to create the enclosure and the shade. So again, just value adding on top of what the brief requires without costing any extra money. Next. So Junee Library, a long time ago now for us, but maybe where it started for us in working with social infrastructure. This was the children's part of the library, and you can see it's separated but viewing onto the main stack of the library. And we planned this out so that you could get full access to this room after hours with through its own security door and system, and it also had access to the kitchen and toilets. So the idea here was that there were a lot of meetings going on in the old existing library. The librarian liked to bake in the library, so there's an oven in the kitchen, and this room could just continue to have that role in the community where people can have a meeting and they can bake a cake for the meeting in the kitchen while they're having the meeting. Next slide. Okay, and then the final series of slides are really about how we really think a lot about what the space is, sorry, outside the front door of any of our buildings, because we think that space to gather and to run into people and to connect with people, a lot of it does happen as people are entering and leaving a building or a facility. And so we're always very careful that there's a really generous amount of space for people to do that at the front of buildings, and that adds possibility for lots of extra program. If you just go to the next one as well. So this is a big awning onto the street at Cobargo that you can see in this little render. It's possible to set it up as little markets, or it could be cafe tables, or it could be handball, or it could be, it can be for any number of uses that the community dream up, but no one has to pay to be there, importantly. And it just gives you the opportunity to stop. So Art Space, which is an art gallery project right in the city in Woolloomooloo. One of the key moves and really important moves we think we achieved with this one is to move the front entry door from a busy road with a very narrow footpath onto a public plaza around the corner from its original entry. And that just activates that whole plaza and gives people space to spill out of the building without being kind of pushed along by the traffic. And then just two final ones. Gilgandra Library was a project to convert an old supermarket into a library in Gilgandra. The front door was onto the street, but beside it was a vacant block. We convinced the council to go for another grant to convert that vacant block into a public plaza and take the entry from the library from the plaza. So thereby kind of activating that space between the library and the next shop, giving a public entry to the library where a lot of other things could happen. And then I think the final one is it's actually not the front door, but the back door into the youth centre, where we needed to provide access directly to the skate park, which is just right of the frame of the photo, and allow lots of people to kind of gather between the youth centre, internal of the youth centre, and the external of the skate park, and making that interstitial space, which is really useful for community buildings. And
on the Gilgandra one as well, it's just worth adding that it was a car park and now it's a space for people, but importantly, it forms part of a disaster relief, a much wider disaster relief strategy that we worked with council on, because it's flood prone in Gilgandra. And what this public space does now is it allows the water to move freely in flood between the river and the high street. So there's a place for the water to exit and not be banked up. So it's interesting how you can use small interventions in small towns to have very wide-reaching kind of disaster relief benefits.
That's it. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Lee and Ashley. So that brings us to the Q&A component of today's session. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A. We've got a really great panel here today, so it's a really good opportunity to ask any burning questions or anything that's on your mind. So I'm going to stop sharing and allow you to see all of our beautiful Q&As, panelist faces. So let's get into the questions. And Sarah, I'm going to start by throwing to you. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about how you can measure the sort of success of social assets and what that kind of monitoring and evaluation process looks like.
Thanks, Phoebes. I think we were talking about this before we started, so I think there'll be some other feedback as well from the rest of the group. But I think that the monitoring and tracking of the value of investing in social assets is really not happening at the level that it should be. And I think this is across, you know, community centres, investments in community groups and services, etc. And I think it's a really missing piece. And we did a guide for all local councils in New South Wales around how to build social cohesion. And one of the things that came out from the majority of the council representatives was that without evidence of the value that social assets create, it's really hard to get your leaders or your decision makers or the people who fund you to invest in those social assets. And so there are lots of ways that you can do this. And it's really about embedding, tracking and monitoring at the beginning of a project. So we're seeing way more grants now requiring an evaluation process, which is really fantastic because that's the evidence that people can use then to show, look, we did it here and this is how it changed things. Another way, and I know a lot of local councils across Australia talk about this as well, is just having a regular social cohesion survey that they do where you're able to ask people questions about how connected they feel, what sorts of social assets that they prioritize. We're talking about connections. We're talking about connections to government, connections to neighbours, and connections to services, for example. And as you invest in those social assets, you can see the change over time by doing that really well representative survey in a recurring way. So you can actually track the change against the investment that you're making. I think from the building perspective, from community buildings that build community, there's a lot we can do, don't you think? Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
Yep.
we've actually used the Arts Council of England a number of years ago did a study on being able to monetize health and well-being, specifically looking at museums and galleries, which sounds like an ugly process. However, they used the National Health Service metrics to measure the impact it has over people's lifetimes. And so those that visit galleries and museums versus those that don't. And to cut the story short, they basically came up with a number that said it was £1,500 per person per visit per year is what it put back into the economy. That then got accepted by government to be able to be included in green papers for grant applications. And we've started in the last couple of years seeing economists in Australia accepting those metrics and being able to monetize the value of these social assets. And I think from our perspective, it doesn't really matter whether it's $1 or $1,000. The point is that it's actually adding value back in and it's not costing anything. And so why not do it? So the question is why we shouldn't be asked the question, why should we? It's why shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And when you phrase it like that back to the client, it's quite clear that, you know, we should. And then we can start measuring the impact that has over time. Yeah,
and just to add to that, there's also significant measurements of the costs of not doing it. So I think it's something like $20 billion it costs the government in mental health services that relates specifically to people feeling socially isolated. This kind of short-term thinking about it's going to cost me this much money to build this amazing centre or to invest in this service is costing us billions of dollars as a society overall. And I think, yeah, it's time to start flipping the conversation. I totally agree.
All right, fantastic. And I think on the topic of services, we do have a question here wondering if we can elaborate on sort of the assets that aren't materials, so those services that might be offered through the material assets And this person has noticed that there is, heaps of information available on what kinds of material assets are important, how to use them better, and all those sorts of things, but not so much on the services and activities that you can deliver through them. Sarah, did you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah, I just think from a research perspective, across every state, there is a Council of Social Services. So there's NCOS, VCOS. They do a lot of incredible research about the social services sector, the value that they deliver, the programs that they deliver. And actually, post-floods, post-fires, and post-COVID, there is some incredible research that they've delivered about the value of all these different services and the services and programs that they deliver. I think if you start there, you'll get some great information. I think just some things that Jen and I know is that, they're really under-resourced. They're working so hard. A lot of them are volunteer-based. And I think whatever support they can get and whatever additional funding they can get, and assistance with writing grants is a big one that we hear all the time. A lot of them are very grant dependent. The better those services can be and the stronger they can be. But I would start by looking at some of the research by the VCOS, NCOS, and the Council of Social Services. There's really incredible information there.
Beautiful. And I've got a question for Dunhillam over here. So now that you've worked on so many designs over the years, what are some trends that you are seeing emerge? And what are some things that the funders are really ready to embrace? And what are some of the more hard to convince ones?
Trends are, I think, difficult to identify in a meaningful way, to be honest, around this work. I think we've been humans living in cities for a very, very long time and living in places. And so there's a lot of common issues that we need to be dealing with there. We always start from a starting point of adding civic dignity to every project that we're doing, or civic decorum and personal dignity. And the way that you then find the specific things that people are willing to fund is by doing that initial work that CRED are talking about. Is you ask the community and you talk to the community about what's needed, and they're the ones that understand. And it's very hard then for funders to turn around and disagree with the community that they've just offered to fund. And so it's not about us coming in with ideas from outside necessarily. It's about being able to listen carefully and constructively and be able to turn that back into a discussion about saying, well, the community's identified this and we can do it in the following ways.
Yeah. Sorry.
So I think there's a lot of what grant funders are looking for is that the whole project has been authentically driven from the community, from the needs of the community. And you can't really fake that. You just have to have done the research. You have to have asked all the questions. And then therefore it's not necessarily transferable to another town because it can be quite idiosyncratic what that town needs. But I think the other thing that they're looking for, they're all people who are doling out this money in grant funding are trying to spread that money as well and as effectively as they can. So they're looking for ways that, one project can really integrate and solve a number of problems.
That's right.
So if you're going to, say in Gilgandra, create a new library that is also going to be a business innovation hub, it's also going to provide tech resources for people in the community and public open space and deal with some of the flood and resilience issues around flooding, then you're starting to get their interest because they're thinking, okay, we can tick all of these boxes and we can. So I think it's really about thinking very laterally about the whole town and what it needs and how this project can key into the issues of the entire town, not just say a library for books.
Importantly,
I totally agree. Sorry, Ashley.
No, I'm jumping in.
No, I was just going to say that's absolutely I would say one of the biggest trends is nothing can be one thing anymore.
Yeah.
With land so expensive and building so expensive and all those sorts of things. Every building has to build multiple communities and deliver multiple community outcomes, including that emergency space when emergencies are needed. I think I would say that's the biggest trend that we're definitely seeing.
And building on that, Sarah, every community has its idiosyncrasies, as you said.
It does.
So we can have the themes, like you said, Ashley, across types of places, but really you have to talk to community to understand those idiosyncrasies to get it right. Otherwise, you risk really getting it quite wrong.
That's right, Jen. And I think what I think sometimes people get mixed up with, well, communities don't know how to build a building. Well, they don't know how to build a building, and they shouldn't be asked how to build a building, and they shouldn't be asked how to design a building, but they can tell you what their experience is, and then they can tell you what needs or outcomes they need to achieve through those buildings. And I think that's so wonderful to hear you as designers talking that way.
It's music to our ears.
Yes.
You're our friends. Thanks.
think
The other thing, oh, sorry, Phoebe. The other thing that I think is really important, becoming more and more important, and it is the whole designing with country aspect of work. It's more than an Indigenous cultural knowledge aspect to a project that we're looking for, because we just want in our projects to use what is known about this place to make the project fit better. You know, a project that fits in its community fits in so many different ways. It fits the community's needs, it fits in terms of aesthetics of the town or the style of the town, but it also fits in its place because it understands country. I think it's really we're just beginning to do that work in a proper way, I think.
Yeah, agree, Lee.
Yeah,
More
and I think
questions,
that
Phoebe?
leads nicely into another question, which I think you have probably already sort of answered, but when it comes to social assets, can you say what good looks like? And should government have a standard of the kind of assets that should be available to support social cohesion? Any thoughts on this one?
As people that work with standards and benchmarks all the time, a benchmark can provide an aspiration that you might want to achieve. And I don't think it should be something that restricts or kind of stops innovation and stops creativity and the unique place-based needs of places. So I think a standard and a benchmark is useful to a best practice thing you want to meet, but as we've just heard from Lee and Ashley, things just change all the time, right? Like needs of communities are different. Some are high density, some are spatially dispersed, some are culturally diverse. I noticed there's a question in there that might be a good one for Jen to answer. And so there are many, many indicators of the kind of outcomes you want to achieve, including community experience, community sentiment, you know, quality, access and proximity, all those different things. So I think a range of standards can help us understand needs and what we might want to strive for. But I think it's always important to come back to what specific and places and people need.
Definitely. And I think I will throw over to Jen for this next one. So the question is, in regions like Greater Western Sydney, where communities are quite culturally diverse, how do you go about finding that common ground to inform planning and program of the social asset?
Thanks, Phoebes. And thanks for the question, Faith. It's a really good question, but it's the same as you go about with the rest of the committee. It means talking to people. So whether that means designing culturally appropriate engagement, using translations and interpreters if needed, also drawing on local leaders to help facilitate those conversations where there's trust already built in those communities, can be really important to get people sitting down at the table. Providing the information, the background information for our culturally and linguistically diverse communities to understand what it is that we're talking to them about and to understand that it is a safe conversation. A lot of people come from places where talking to government is a really scary thing to do. So actually getting people to sit at the table to start with, it can be really challenging. So really designing a culturally safe engagement program is your number one thing. And once that information has been disseminated and you have a group of people who you've built capacity with, you've used local leaders, then I would suggest that it's a matter of making sure that you're integrating those conversations with the broad community. So the community as a whole, a representative sample of that community is being spoken to so that you get a real sense of what people need and how to move forward on your policy or design decisions.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jen. And I think now I'm going to throw to Lee and Ashley. So we've got a question here from Stephen. And Stephen asks, are there any good examples or research of social asset creation for linear corridors that you know of or could speak to?
What do you mean by linear corridors? Do you know what?
You mean like laneways?
Like, or main streets, like along a main street, perhaps?
I think linear corridors are the new public open space because no one's got any land for a park anymore, perhaps.
Maybe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, there are a few. I think that's what they mean, and there's some really beautiful stuff that was done from the recent. Oh gosh, you keep talking. I'll look it up and tell you.
So there's a series of studies that have been done again in the UK around the importance of the high street as part of re-engaging the centre of a place back into community. And part of the research that I'm Professor of Practice at Sydney University in the Architecture School, and my kind of research area is actually looking at these ideas of high streets in regional centres. At the moment, I would say looking at maybe Macquarie Street in Dubbo is the beginning of a good example, where that street, at least the top half of it, has been reimagined with a number of community asset projects that have been privately funded, and a couple of local government funded projects around museums like the jail that's really revitalised that main street. And it's taken the emphasis off the pubs and entertainment and more into a daytime economy of people coming in and accessing social networks. The work that's being done in the UK is specifically looking at dying high streets because of the death of the traditional retail model. And that's really relevant in Australia as well, where we can't, owners of buildings, and Alice Springs is a really bad example of what's happened rather than a good example, where owners of buildings are still looking at trying to make money out of leasing retail space, and no one wants shops anymore because everyone's buying everything off, online, and the post office is actually the main hub. And so it's looking at how we can reuse that high street and revitalise that high street by putting things like allied health and other places that used to be in the civic offices of government back into the high street. Libraries have been trying to do this for a number of years, and I think are starting to become quite successful at it. So you can go and get, for instance, your driving license renewed at a few local libraries now, and you don't have to go to the council office anymore. So it's looking at the high street in that way.
And I just had a little quick look, and if we're talking about like linear green corridors and things like that, I think, even though I'm not normally saying positive things about WestConnex, but the Canal to Creek Public Art Program was really a beautiful linear project where they commissioned 18 incredible artworks that represented the communities along that sort of St. Peter's to Beverly Hills link. There were beautiful First Nations artworks, young people, all sorts of things. And even though that's not like a service, it did help people to connect to that place as it was changing so much, and to have beautiful places to go and interact with as a community and connect with each other. So that's a really nice example too.
All right, well, that does bring us to the end of the session today. So thank you so much to our wonderful panel for sharing all your insights today. And thank you as well to everyone who dialed in and submitted questions. I think we got to pretty much all of them, so I really appreciate all of that. And I hope this session has been useful to you all. We do have a quick feedback poll that I'm going to launch now. It just helps us plan our webinars and really understand whether these types of sessions are useful to you all. So any feedback you have would be much appreciated. And today's webinar has been recorded, so we will send the recording around to all of you if you would like to refer back to it or share it with someone who missed the session. And we will probably post that on social media as well, so that's a little bit easier for you. So if you do have any questions or would like to chat further, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We'd love to chat with you, and we're always available. You can see our contact details up on the screen here. Stay tuned for our next Creducation webinar, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.